It may or may not surprise you to know that more than a quarter of Australians don't speak English as the only language at home. In 2019, the Australian Bureau of Statistics reported that the proportion of people living in Australia who'd been born overseas was nearly 30%, some 7.5 million people. My parents are examples, born in Singapore, but moved to Australia to study at the University of Queensland in 1980. I was born in Brisbane, but my parents soon took me back to Singapore, where I spent all my childhood. So when I moved back here at the age of 16, it felt like it was my first time. I mean, I spoke English, and I didn't find it too hard to fit in, but there was still a lot to get used to. For example, my friend's parents asking me to call them by their first name. You would never do that in most Asian cultures. It'd be so rude. Almost every society on Earth today is made up of multiple cultures, but it's often the people who arrive second or third or later who have to deal with the challenges of making a new place home. In these final lessons, we'll be looking at the effect that cultural diversity has on human behavior and psychology, starting with immigration. So, what is immigration? Well, it's the act of moving from your native homeland to a new country or place to find a new home, an area in which you don't possess citizenship and may not even have the right to work or stay permanently. Note that this is different from migration, which usually involves moving within the same country. Moving on its own is already stressful, but people often immigrate because they're in need of work or are escaping war, political persecution, or natural disasters. If you've lived in Australia your whole life, it can be very difficult to imagine what that's like, and that's okay. But imagine trying to sleep at night when you're always hearing gunfire in the distance and the mixed feelings of relief and sadness because you've got the chance to escape, but what you're running away from is your own home. We listen to the stories of refugees because they experience some of the harshest effects of immigration and help us understand more about cross-cultural research. In particular, we're going to look at the challenges of culture shock, assimilation, and acculturation. The feeling of being overwhelmed or confused by the differences in cultures when a person first moves to a new country is called culture shock. There are different ways people experience this, but it usually involves frustration, loneliness, sadness, and feeling homesick. Of course, these are all completely natural responses. People going on holidays to exotic locations might experience in a very small way what that feels like. For example, seeing people eating fried spiders or scorpions as street food in some Southeast Asian countries. When the change is permanent though, you can appreciate how difficult it must be. You may have witnessed this yourself in international students at school. The good thing is that many people overcome culture shock with time and eventually feel happier and less homesick in the new country. There are then two ways that we describe how immigrants or incoming cultures might fit into the new country. If they fully blend in, we say they've assimilated. If they retain a lot of their cultural distinction, we say they've acculturated. Let's look at each. Assimilation involves adopting local cultural ideals and gradually losing aspects such as language, food, and rituals, such that eventually the minority and majority cultures don't look very different. Now, that doesn't mean that the immigrant completely loses their previous identity. It's a bit of a two-way process because the majority culture ends up changing a bit too. But we might use the analogy of adding salt to a stew. The stew changes in taste, but you can't really see the salt anymore afterwards. This might remind you of multiculturalism, which does allow for minority groups to retain some of their identity, provided it fits within the majority culture's framework. Baltej Singh was the first Canadian mountain ranger allowed to wear a turban as part of his traditions, but with the official uniform and responsibilities of the Canadian Mounties. Many immigrants end up assimilating into the new culture because they're more likely to be accepted and feel like they belong. However, many immigrants also choose to retain in the new country many of their previous cultural markers, such as language, traditions, food, and values. They'll still abide by the rules of the new country, to different extents, but their original culture dominates. We call this acculturation. Just like assimilation, it's a two-sided act. In fact, immigrants might be able to switch between both cultures, perhaps embracing their old culture at home and the new one at school or work. In this sense, they may even be described as being bicultural. You might recognize this as being similar to pluralism. Of course, not every immigrant will adapt to the new culture in the same way. One family member might end up assimilating much more than another, which can understandably result in a lot of friction. Often the first generation of immigrants is more likely to want to retain the culture of their home country, while their children might want to embrace the majority culture. We call this an acculturation gap, and it often puts a lot of pressure on families. Understanding culture shock and the pressures faced by immigrants allows us to find ways to make the transition easier, such as helping them to know what to expect, giving immigrants ways to assimilate but also maintain their culture if they wish, and it also involves educating the majority culture to avoid being afraid of immigrants. A country that works to avoid discrimination and make everyone feel welcome is definitely one that I want to be a part of.